Staufer has covered the development of photography, sound recording, and the electron tube. In this final session, he will explore the advent of digital imaging technology, which allows the individual to share their creations globally. Clay?
Okay, thank you, Phil. Appreciate that. Yes, welcome to session 3 of Technological Revolutions and the Arts. And we're going to talk about digital imaging. That's true, but we're going to talk about everything that we've covered so far and more. So we'll try to pack everything we can into this final session. And I hope that that won't deter anybody from making a comment or asking a question, because I think at this point, we're going to be talking about things, a lot of things that are happening to us now. And it would be interesting to know people's reactions to these revolutions and these changes that we're witnessing at this point. When we were talking about the phonograph, of course, and so-called silent movies, we really didn't experience that, but the things that are going on now, we are experiencing. So I'm just going to get rid of that if I can. Anyway, so the digital revolution and beyond, and here we go. I got to get rid of this. For some reason, this didn't go away.
Any help there, Clay?
I'm just trying to get rid of this window. Last week it went away on its own pretty quickly, but and because I can't see my mouse.
Oh, it might be a good idea to stop your share if you want to do that first and bring things back up.
I'll just stop that if I can. And
There you
rid
go.
of that. Okay, and then hit play. Here we go.
There we go. Sorry about that. I think that was my fault with the recording. So
No, that's all right.
to
No, I don't think it was. I just think it's some kind of a strange thing that happened. Anyway,
Okay.
So last session, just to quickly review, we want to review and extend our discussion of photography, sound, and film. We want to discuss modernism and the arrival of postmodernism in art mid-20th century. We want to survey the technological breakthroughs that enabled computer advances, which drove a lot of what we're going to talk about. And we want to spend some time considering the analog and digital worlds, so to speak, their characteristics and how the arts might be affected by digitalization. We're going to take a little bit of time and look at artificial intelligence, how it could change art. Look at a case study in music, how digitalization has changed the way musicians work and carry out their vocations. And then we'll try to review the journey that we've taken and try to see if we can get some insight into just what has happened since 1839 and what's happened to human beings. Are we different? We certainly are, but in what ways are we different? Let's kind of get our footing here. Let's go back to really the late 19th century and talk just briefly about what happened after photography came on the scene. We had art movements such as Cubism, Fauvism, Post-Impressionism, Dadaism, Constructivism, Futurism, as reactions to the machine age and photography in particular, and the ability of photography to make copies in a seemingly unlimited way. Interestingly, we had something called Dadaism, a reaction to the machine age and the mechanization of life in the developed world, challenging the conventions and social functions of art. basically asking, what is art? Is it just what the art world says is art, or is there something intrinsic in an object? So we'll come back to that, because Dadaism is one of them, like we want to label it modernism. Dadaism has continued more of an attitude than a movement per se. Bauhaus, the modernist industrial design movement, sort of glorifying the machine aesthetic. And most important, something that we want to talk about is art for art's sake, which really was kind of the credo of the modernist era. Art became kind of withdrew into its own sphere, and the art world set itself up as, it sort of enshrined itself in a way. And so we have a number of different movements that challenge that, particularly as we got into the 60s. Conceptual art is one, arte povera is another, art brut, and so forth. So we're in the mid 20th century, let's suppose, in the time machine, take ourselves back. And we've had these paradigm shattering innovations of photography and cinematography. And so artists are continuing to have to understand, how do we paint now? How do we paint when a copy is so easy to make, and we have technology that can create imagery that is completely convincing? And in other words, we had what's often called a crisis of representation. How do you paint in a world like that? What do you paint? That's another question. And as I mentioned, so rather than taking these issues head on, the art world, the marketplace, if you will, for art, galleries and museums sought refuge in the doctrine of art for art's sake. And this was kind of what reigned until the late 1950s, when, for lack of a better phrase, neo-Dada and pop art again challenged very convincingly modernism, and in some ways brought it down. Although modernism, again, is more of a posture than a specific movement. During this time, remember, film, and we shortchanged film because we just we didn't really have the time to address film as a mass medium, but it became the most important mass medium. Certainly before television, it was unrivaled. And this was where opinions were shaped, social attitudes were formed. It was without a doubt the most powerful medium ever created to transform consciousnesses on a mass scale. More recently, the convergence of imagery, television, cinema, and video in our age has again compelled artists to question all forms of representation and representational media. Just again, what do you do? How do you do it? How do you get a message across? Should you get a message across? All these are questions that are up for grabs. And I chose this photo by O. Winston Link, not so much for any intrinsic quality other than I liked how the drive-in movie sort of set against the passage of a almost surrealistic steam engine in the background, sort of showed where we were at that point in the mid 20th century, in our automobiles, watching movies, two technologies that radically changed how we looked at the world. So let's talk a little bit about high modernism. And I call it high modernism because it did have a almost a high church sort of aspect in terms of the theory. Clement Greenberg, Michael Fried, critics and theorists talking about art. It became very rarefied and cerebral, and we can all remember ourselves, perhaps, saying, I don't really know how to approach this painting. And the famous remark, well, my kid can paint better than that. And this was sort of in the mid 20th century, how art withdrew. And there's a quotation here from Michael Fried. He's still alive, a great critic and art historian. And I like what he wrote here. In a sense, modernist art in this century, he's talking about the 20th century, finished what society in the 19th century began, the alienation of the artist from the general preoccupations of the culture in which he is embedded, and the prizing loose of art itself from the concerns, aims, and ideals of that culture. And this was where artists were focusing on critiquing painting itself. And this was again in reaction to the capabilities of technology to do all the other things that artists once did. A contrasting, although somewhat in agreement, observer Daniel Bell, often seen as a more conservative voice in cultural studies and philosophy, traditional modernism sought to substitute for religion or morality an aesthetic justification of life. To create a work of art, to be a work of art, this alone provided meaning in man's effort to transcend himself. Of course, nowadays, we wouldn't probably say man's, we'd say a person's, but you can sort of tell when that was written. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, Morris Louis, Helen Frankenthaler, all the great modernist artists of the mid 20th century who were trying to strip painting down to its essentials, and in so doing created some marvelous work. Until along came some sort of revolutionary figures. Jasper Johns is one. His painting Flag was a real milestone. In a way, sort of recapitulating Marcel Duchamp and the question of what is an art object? What does it mean to call something art? How do we treat that differently from something else? And his friend and sometime collaborator, Robert Rauschenberg, and his constructions, this one called Bed from 1955, a radically different direction from modernism as practiced by their contemporaries. And of course, pop art itself, a reaction to the post-war consumer culture, it really changed everything, because it again called into question in a humorous yet pointed way just what was art supposed to do? How is art going to exist in this consumer culture in which images were just proliferating beyond our ability to really comprehend? Remember, we talked about the copy and the destruction of the aura as Walter Benjamin defined it, and we'll talk about that a little bit more today. Andy Warhol, along with Rauschenberg and Johns and others of that era, understood intuitively, if not entirely consciously, although who knows, what was going on with the reproducibility of imagery and the power of imagery, and certainly a lot of commentary on, especially with a film star like Marilyn Monroe, who had recently just died when he made this, what it meant to be an idol, a movie star idol in that era. Again, that extending the concept of the aura perhaps to an individual as well as an object. So he would appropriate her image and use it to say something, or perhaps not say something. Just proliferating it was perhaps enough. But along came something I think, and a lot of people think that the social disruptions of the 1960s and early 70s called into question the entire post-war order, and so-called critical theory, particularly deconstructionism, the French writers, Bourdieu, Foucault, began to really question modernism. Jameson, a lot of American writers joined into that. And in all of these postmodern writings, challenging modernism, and these three themes really emerge. And this is kind of the heart of what we often call postmodernism, a critique of the myth of originality. I think the position in a postmodern position would be that there is no one reality available to us to explain our beliefs and sensations. We are all in our own, it's reality. It's sort of a hyper subjectivity. In terms of deconstructionism, Derrida and others, meaning exists only with reference to other texts and utterances. When push comes to shove, something only makes sense in the light of other comparative texts. And this was pursued to its sort of logical conclusion. And both of these tenets, if you will, make appropriation a suitable artistic act. And I put a still there of Cindy Sherman, who did a long series of film stills in which she would dress up as a particular film, as if she were a movie actor. And so she was always in costume. And I think this was a way of critiquing originality and difference. Tenet number 2, if you will, critique of the grounds of difference. This was maybe looking at things from a more global perspective, opposition to hegemonic culture. The post-World War II order around the globe was challenging what the world was like right after World War II, when it was the United States as sort of the last nation standing, if you will, the strongest presence economically in the world and culturally to boot. And in the art and philosophical world, there was an opposition to this sort of monolithic presence. And then lastly, but not least, a critique of historical narratives. Postmodernism realizes that historical narratives typically serve a particular point of view at the expense of other points of view, so that they need to be critiqued, they need to be challenged, and seldom present the whole truth. So these three sort of points are a pretty fair representation of a postmodern point of view. And we'll see that this continues up and through our own time. And the upshot of this for art, in one respect, was that the museum, and in particular the museum curator, became an extremely important figure in the art world. And we're familiar with all the big shows that over the past 20 years or so that have been at the Art Institute or the Museum of Modern Art that have assumed the air of a spectacle. A big show on Cezanne, a big show on Winslow Homer, and these are multimedia shows, and they really do, while they celebrate the artist and the work, they really do assume the character of a spectacle, not necessarily in the bad sense of the word, or the critical sense, but just as spectacles, places you go to see a spectacle. So the curator is very important. Photography, remember, how photography began in its infancy. And Walter Benjamin, in fact, talked about the destruction of the aura of an original art object would mean that the ritual function of a work of art would sort of wither away, and what would be left would be a political value, a political understanding of an art object. And in the postmodern world, this really starts to become true. Art is no longer withdrawn in some kind of inner sanctum of the wings of a museum. It's out in the world. Barbara Kruger, here's a piece of her work. Jenny Holzer, who would sort of anonymously place her truisms on digital signs in Times Square, for instance. These authors or these artists were challenging in either a pointed political way or maybe a more subtle way these issues of authorship, subjectivity, and uniqueness. And it just turns out as that photography, each time you make a photograph, those issues are brought into play. Well, all this is going on. I think we can all remember that in our lifetimes. These changes occurring, the 70s, the Arab oil embargo, the political changes that occurred. But while that was going on, something else was building up steam, so to speak, and that was the arrival of a whole new way of looking at phenomena in terms of binary code. I want to pause just for a moment and bring back a quote from Paul Valéry, the great French poet, something he wrote in 1928 in an essay called, it's a short essay, it's really a wonderful thing to read, called The Conquest of Ubiquity. Quote, just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs, so shall we be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand. So very prescient and valuable, not just for its sort of gee whiz factor that, oh, he was able to see this, but just as a reminder that this is kind of the curve that we've been on, the trajectory, so to speak. So I made a little chart here, and I'd love to have some discussion at this point, because I just don't want to keep rattling on, but I tried to make a little schematic, if you will, of how things have changed, where we are, how things have been converging. And on the left side, I try to represent so-called analog world, the world of phenomena. And we'll talk more about the distinctive characteristics of analog versus digital. But we started off with painting, history painting, minstrel shows, and vaudeville. Still photography was an amazing advance in human history. We actually had a pre-digital digital medium called player piano, in which you'll remember piano rolls had holes punched in them, and a piano would basically be played by this this medium, which was a fascinating progenitor of a lot of things that we have, primitive though it was, that we have today. We had Nickelodeons, cinema, as we talked about last week. We made the transition from silent into sound. Ultimately, television grew out of the vacuum tube technology. Video, home video, DVDs and CDs became obsolete almost as quickly as they came on the scene. And now we have something called streaming, which is right now is the forefront of film distribution and music distribution and data distribution, of course. Looking ahead, what do we, augmented reality, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence. And few really know where this is going to take us. And I hope we have time to talk about that. But things have been converging. And ultimately, in the upper right-hand corner, I have the word information. We're moving toward a world in which all phenomena are subsumable or translatable ultimately into information, either binary code or some kind of multi-bit code in which reality can be simulated and interpreted. Any questions or comments at this point, or anything that you want to challenge that I've said or add to? Certainly I don't have the whole story.
Clay, there's nothing in the chat window, but I personally had a question for you.
Okay.
Back to your slide about abstract art. I was curious, there was a piece on the right-hand side of the screen that I didn't quite see. The author, the painter of, but I was curious if abstract art does anything for anyone in this class, because I know that's kind of, you touched that on your comments there, this was kind of a rejection of the beautiful art that we had seen up to that point, and kind of the simplified version of that. Does anyone like abstract art? Does anyone have any abstract art in their home? I was just curious. Clay, do you? It doesn't appear like it on the back wall. From what I see, you look like more of a Warhol person.
Yeah,
Behind you.
That's an interesting piece. That's a sort of a Native American take on Andy Warhol, I suppose, with buffaloes. But yeah, that's a good question. We do have some abstractions, but I'd like you, I'd like to hear from others how they might feel or not feel about abstract art.
Sarah Briggs has come off mute. If you want to address that, or if you have another question, you're welcome to pose that.
Well, I have to say, there is some abstract art I really like, and some I don't. So I think it depends on the artist. But my comment actually was to Clay's point about art becoming part of a spectacle, and certainly the immersive Van Gogh exhibits that have become so popular are a great example of that. And again, that's bringing together so many, the new technologies in tandem with Van Gogh's art, and making it more of an entertainment experience, perhaps than an art appreciation experience as such. So it's been hugely popular, and the tickets are quite expensive, and it's interesting how that has really taken off.
So that's actually, I should have thought of that, Sarah, because that was exactly what I was trying to get at, was what is the distinction between art and entertainment? And is art a form of entertainment, or, as some of the modernist figures who are in our pantheon might say, it's a matter of life and death, or it's much more than that. But yeah, that's a great example. I haven't been to it, but I've heard about it, and the multimedia sensorium that you're sort of treated to, as I understand. How does that square or not square with Van Gogh's work itself, and how would the artist have felt about this? And does it matter to how he would have, all these are, I think, really important questions.
Just wanted to relay a couple of comments from the chat box here, Clay.
Okay.
One is a testament to you. You are a genius and obviously a Renaissance man. So you've got some fans out there. And then Mary Voss said, those of us who are near our 80s have lived through this entire revolution that you're talking about. And as someone who hasn't, I find it interesting to go back and see this. My question for you as a follow-up to that was, as each of these arrows drives us further to the right of the screen here, how many of them have replaced others? Because there's this whole conversation now that streaming will replace the theatrical release model, and that movie theaters will go away because people are watching movies more from home. I'm curious, to me, Nickelodeon is a TV channel, so that's a whole new thing for me to see that phrase there. But, you know, vaudeville, the Nickelodeon itself, those seem to be replaced in some fashions by some of these technological revolutions. Do you see those continuing to replace each other, or are they going to harmoniously exist?
Well, we're going to talk more about streaming, and but there's no reason why we can't kind of do it twice or make. I think streaming is here to stay, and I think it will still have movie theaters. We've got a great one here in town, but worldwide, nationally, the so-called theater window, in which new releases from the big motion picture producers are exclusive to theaters, that window is getting shorter and shorter, and I think may someday just evaporate. And streaming makes so much sense in so many ways, particularly in a COVID environment. I think COVID really had some huge effects there. And in terms of distribution, there's just so many reasons why, and we'll go into it. I've got a slide on that coming up, but I think that's the direction we're going. And artificial intelligence, augmented reality will continue to affect. And I think you could look at the rise, you know, the evolution of special effects in a movie theater as a variety of, or an early progenitor of augmented reality. And I think that will only continue as audiences want to be immersed in an experience and to get close up. And I hope, my plan was to end up with a sort of a philosophical discussion on that at the end of this session.
Thanks, Clay. Sorry to jump ahead on you there, but Marie, Marie?
Yeah, I just had kind of like a comment and a thought about abstract art, impressionistic art. Some of us remember Del Michael and the type of impressionism and abstract art that he created. And I wonder if any of our galleries still have any of his work. Do you know?
Yeah, well, I see his work around, not so much in galleries, but in homes and offices. So I know that it is out there, and at some point, I'm sure there'll be a show done. The people can lend these pieces to a show or something, and so I guess have that to look forward to.
Clay, just one other thing about this debate about, are we retreating into our own shells, if you will, or own cocoons? There's still a following or a need for live performance, and people seem to really like being part of an audience still, I think. The whole latest thing with Taylor Swift and the inability to get tickets for her shows, and live theater still seems to be continuing, although it's had a tough time coming back from COVID. But people still, at least some people, still seem to like getting together for a live performance and enjoying it as a group.
Absolutely, and I have a slide on what I like to call a philosophy of noise, and I think this is a perfect sort of case study for that. Live theater does inherently have what an audio engineer might call noise in it. That is, you have coughs from the audience, you have the sounds of people shuffling their feet every once in a while, you have all sorts of things going on that are not necessarily the pure signal, that is the pure performance that you're looking at and witnessing. But still, we love to be there, and there is an ineffable indescribable energy that we as human beings pick up from a live performance. So you're absolutely right. And I can't, I'm no judge of how things will go, but I can't imagine that going away. It might go through ups and downs, but there is absolutely no substitute for that. And you're absolutely right. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And I hope a little bit later on this morning to discuss that at a little more length. So very good point. A couple of really good points there.
Thanks, Clay. That wraps up any comments we had. So
Okay.
you're welcome to
I'm
move forward.
gonna kind of go quickly through some of this stuff. I just want to at least address it because that was sort of the premise of the course, was to look at technological milestones and how they affected the arts. So I don't want to give them short shrift, even though at this point, I don't, and there are very few people who really understand what was going on at this point with silicon gates and monolithic integrated circuit chips. But I think we can get a sense that there were sort of miracles being accomplished in laboratories. And one difference between our time and the mid-19th century was that Niepce, for instance, and Daguerre were sort of not ordinary guys, obviously, but they weren't products of extensive education in the sciences. I mean, certainly Faraday was, but a lot of these things that happened to further artistic uses of technology were done by artists, not so much specialists. But at this point, we're in a world where you have to be a specialist to develop complementary metal oxide semiconductors, and this research is just mind-boggling. So this was what was happening from 1947 on. The first transistor using germanium, a silicon kind of mineral, and essentially doing what a vacuum tube could do, only in 1/20th or 100th of the space occupied by a vacuum tube, and 100th of the energy, perhaps, maybe less. And then going on, more getting closer to our own contemporary period here, the Department of Defense and the federal government was working on ways to communicate that were not vulnerable to attack. And they worked out protocols for internetworking in which multiple separate networks would be joined into a network of networks. The next thing we know, the home computer is introduced in the early 70s, Microsoft, Apple in the mid 70s, and then a really big moment. Intel announces its 4004 single circuit microprocessor, which contained 2,300 transistors on a chip about the size of your fingernail. And from then, things just accelerated. You've heard of Moore's law in terms of, I can't recite it, but the ability of engineers to pack more and more computing power and storage into smaller and smaller spaces, so that you had 2,300 transistors on a chip in 1971. That was a big deal. The latest Apple processor, I think, had more than 100 billion transistors. It's beyond, certainly beyond my capability of imagining. But what all this has done is enabled us to do things like talk to our phones and talk to each other and simulate reality. So let's talk a little bit about what the analog world is like, what the digital world is like, and keeping in mind what we talked about with live theater as an example of analog type of experience. In the analog world, there's a continuous range of values. if you were to measure voltage in an analog way, you would not have any, it would just be a constant range, a continuous range. In the digital world, we measure in terms of sampling slices. And although we can sample so many slices that it comes close to infinitely approximating a continuous range of values, but at its fundamental level, it's not a continuous range. So in the analog world, electrical quantities, say voltage, are analogs of physical quantities. So in an analog speedometer, the varying voltage as you go faster or slower is reflected on your dial. So it's not actually, the voltage is showing you what the speed is. It's in an analog way. In the digital world, the values of physical quantities are encoded as binary numbers in base 2, for instance. And again, using slices, small samples. In the analog world, copying is imperfect. However close it may seem, however perfect it may seem, there is inherently noise. You remember the recording of Thomas Edison talking about going around the world and all the scratchiness, and that's an extreme example of noise. But think of your records, if any of you still have any long playing records or even 78s. I don't know who would have them, but you hear the scratches as the noise of the friction of the stylus in the groove. And so copying is an imperfect process. And if you make a copy of a copy in an analog fashion, they progressively degrade with each generation. And you can see that, of course, we've all had that experience with a photocopier. You're making a copy of a copy of a copy. It's not as good as the first series of copies that you made. In the digital world, there is such a thing as error-free copying and transmission. And it's staggering, but that's what happens when you can just focus on the signal and remove all the noise. A good example, again, of a medium, analog medium, is a phonograph record. And a good example of a medium, a storage medium, say for music, is the MP streaming that we're familiar with. If we listen to Apple Music or Pandora or Spotify, again, it's a code sampled 40, I think the standard right now is 44,100 times a second. So that's how come it's so lifelike, but it still isn't continuous when push comes to shove. We may not be able to perceive that. There is that whole question, but I guess this is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I would say in the analog world, we have unmediated experiential phenomena. That is a direct experience of the cold or the heat or the sun. We may be able to sample that or simulate it in the visual or in the digital world in virtual reality, but it's a simulation, not the actual experience itself. In analog, we have a divergence of disciplines. We have various types of art, painting, we have video, which again, in the digital world, these are all converging into virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence. We talked about the inherent noise in analog, and then the fact that digital is either no noise or arguably maybe there is an ultra high signal to noise ratio, but basically no noise. One of the most important things from our standpoint historically, given the whole span of what we've looked at, is that in the analog world, the hardware is typically expensive. If you wanted to be a filmmaker in the analog world in 1935 or 45 or 55, 65, you would have to have a whole lot of equipment, be very expensive. You'd have to buy film. There's a high barrier to entry. And of course, in the world of journalism, you'd almost have to buy your own printing press, which was prohibitively expensive. But in the digital world, hardware and software prices are comparatively low, and they keep getting lower. And so this sort of democratizes fields such as filmmaking and journalism. So I've got a digital camera, a couple of $1,000. I could use that if I had the ability, software and knowledge, so to speak, software in terms of my own brain. I could make a high definition film that could be shown in any movie theater or streamed anywhere if I had the ability. And a lot of young people, I'm focusing on young people here, have this ability. In fact, there have been a number of really revolutionary movies made with an iPhone, for instance. I call it democratization, or it's been called democratization. And I don't think that's a bad term, but it's a leveling influence that has enabled a tremendous amount of communication to occur that otherwise wouldn't have. So that's certainly got a tremendous upside in our world now, our digital world. But what are some of the things that come up once we start moving into a digital world, at least part way, or at least for a time? I remember last week, there was a question about authenticity versus artificiality or manipulation in digital photos. And certainly when you reduce a photograph, so to speak, by reducing it to pixels, if you go to the pixel level, you can manipulate a photo, and there is no, if you do it well enough and carefully enough, there would be no way to tell what is real, what is not. It might as well be real because you have this image. We have increased convergence of art forms, these multimedia installations. We were talking about the Van Gogh spectacle, and taking that kind of thing a little further, kinesthesia, using our whole sensorium to replicate reality, and authorship, originality versus appropriating. There was an interesting example in the world of music where it was Jay-Z was suing someone else. I think it's included in this film that I'm going to show, this clip, for sampling his own voice. And yet in rap, in hip hop, sampling is a recognized technique. And certainly in the art world, appropriation is the basis of a lot of artists' practices. Look at Cindy Sherman, Barbara Kruger. A lot of people will appropriate works without necessarily informing you. And while this was seen as a no-no in the old days, it's a legitimate technique to comment on this issue of authorship and originality. Subjectivity, uniqueness, these are always issues in mass media. Devices used as prostheses, virtual reality headsets. It sort of reminded me of the early kinetoscopes, when the guy has rubber hoses in his ears and is looking through a peep show. I think we're at that stage, or at least at an analogous stage in the development of augmented reality and artificial intelligence. And speaking of artificial intelligence, we really don't know where that will take us other than increased capabilities, and whether machine intelligence, artificial intelligence is like our intelligence or is something more and different. We really don't know yet. I suppose since we are the ones teaching machines early on, they will be like us, these intelligences, but ultimately they may not. I think one thing that's happening is in reaction to the digital world, there is a revival of analog techniques in pursuit of a kind of authenticity. And I'll go into that in a minute. And then there's the issue of escapism. I mean, are we just doing this to entertain and divert ourselves from a world that is not as livable as it once was? I'm going to just play a very short clip about artificial intelligence from The Economist. It's only a couple minutes long, but I think it's worth listening to, watching.
These portraits might look like paintings from centuries gone by, or digital art created by human hands, but they're not. Each one has been imagined and created by an artificial intelligence. It's the brainchild of Mario Klingerman. He's leading a group of artists who are pioneering the use of AI in the world of visual arts.
As an artist, you're always in this interplay between accident and control. So at one side, you want to have control over your work, but at the same time, you also want interesting accidents to happen. Using AI allows me to find a good balance between the two.
This artwork is created using neural networks, computer programs that mimic the structure of the human brain. Mario has trained the system on thousands of portraits from the 17th to 19th centuries. The AI learns from them and creates a never-ending stream of unique portraits.
So I thought that was an interesting early application of artificial intelligence. And I think in a few years, that will sort of be obsolete, as it were. It sort of has the character of, oh, look what we can do, rather than a true artistic breakthrough. But subsequently, maybe the artists will extend that and use it in a similar way, but in a more comprehensive and in-depth way. But it's fascinating to see the power of artificial intelligence in assimilating data and then sorting through it, and something that's really labor intensive for humans and kind of inherently unartistic, I guess we might think. Okay, another example, and I don't know if I'll spend a long time on this. It's another example of using artificial reality in, or augmented reality in an art context. And this was an entry in an AR art prize in Germany. And what happened was you would encounter artificial intelligence represented by masked avatars. You would be wearing these headsets, and you would interact with these avatars, and they would communicate and start to engage you, the user. Interesting term, the user. And so both human and machine would create something that had never been created before. So I think conceptually, this is some ways more interesting than the previous example, and has maybe more possible. They both have possibilities, but this has, to me, a more intriguing possibility. That, but it's certainly certainly eye-opening to see what could happen and what the direction that we could go, and that we probably will go. I think I'll skip playing the film clip just because I want to keep going, and we could always come back to it. But this was not July 2022, but 2021. But speaking of noise and reaction maybe against the digital world, a lot of leading artists are looking at found objects, sort of craft technique rich practices. In Chicago this summer, there was at the Museum of Contemporary Art, there was a really interesting exhibit, installation really by an artist named Nick Cave. And in the background on the photo on the left, you can see this sort of huge tapestry of sewn sequins and objects and so forth that overlaid some text. And so this is all, this hundreds and if not thousands and thousands of hours to put these things together. And so this, I think, is partly a reaction to digital, the digital multimedia installation video, that we have these very tactile and all these objects that have their own individual lives. And so I think this is a direction that a lot of artists, sort of in protest, I think, of some of the more cerebral, AI-oriented works are going. And on the right, there was a Venice 2022 biennial exhibit and an entry to see the earth before the end of the world. And again, you can see that it's very material. It's there's dirt there. There's looks like hair and rope and so forth and so on. Very concrete types of tactile objects. Getting back to AI though, because it's here to stay. I wanted to talk about machine learning and representation. And this is really, I think, very interesting what machines can do now with imagery. You recognize on the left, Vermeer's portrait, or at least the center part was a portrait of a girl with a pearl earring, very famous painting, you all have seen it. But what's around her was painted out by an AI program, just using what's called natural language, or open, just saying, letting the artificial intelligence learn from what it knows it's been exposed to of that era, imagery from that era. And then on the right, given the instructions of create a professional high quality illustration of a giraffe dragon chimera, that's what DALL-E, which is the name of the OpenAI program, created. So you can kind of see what might happen with filmmaking when a director could sit in his or her chair and just sort of talk about a film, and the AI could act as an extraordinarily capable assistant and basically put a film together, at least the storyboard for a film together. I'm going to play a little clip about this software.
Have you ever seen a polar bear playing bass? Or a robot painted like a Picasso? Didn't think so. DALL-E 2 is a new AI system from OpenAI that can take simple text descriptions like a koala dunking a basketball and turn them into photorealistic images that have never existed before. DALL-E 2 can also realistically edit and retouch photos. Based on a simple natural language description, it can fill in or replace part of an image with AI-generated imagery that blends seamlessly with the original. It's called inpainting. In January 2021, OpenAI introduced DALL-E, a system that could generate images from text, like this avocado armchair. DALL-E 2 takes the technology even further with higher resolution, greater comprehension, and new capabilities, like inpainting. It can even start with an image as an input and create variations with different angles and styles. DALL-E was created by training a neural network on images and their text descriptions. Through deep learning, it not only understands individual objects, like koala bears and motorcycles, but learns from relationships between objects. And when you ask DALL-E for an image of a koala bear riding a motorcycle, it knows how to create that or anything else with a relationship to another object or action. The DALL-E research has three main outcomes. First, it can help people express themselves visually in ways they may not have been able to before. Second, an AI-generated image can tell us a lot about whether the system understands us or is just repeating what it's been taught. Third, DALL-E helps humans understand how AI systems see and understand our world. This is a critical part of developing AI that's useful and safe. The technology is constantly evolving, and DALL-E 2 has limitations. If it's taught with images that are incorrectly labeled, like a plane labeled car, and a user tries to generate a car, DALL-E may create a plane. It's like talking to a person who learned the wrong word for something. DALL-E can also be limited by gaps in its training. If you type baboon and DALL-E has learned what a baboon is through images and accurate labels, it will generate a lot of great baboons. But if you type howler monkey and it hasn't learned what a howler monkey is, DALL-E will give you its best idea of what it thinks it could be, like a howling monkey. What's exciting about the approach used to train DALL-E is that it can take what it learned from a variety of other labeled images and then apply it to a new image. Given a picture of a monkey, DALL-E can infer what it would look like doing something it's never done before, like paying its taxes while wearing a funny hat. DALL-E is an example of how imaginative humans and clever systems can work together to make new things, amplifying our creative potential.
Well, I think you can see that the issue of authenticity and originality starts to almost sound quaint in an era of this kind of artificial intelligence. And that as human beings, we're going to have to develop extraordinary critical abilities and antennae, so to speak, to navigate our way through this kind of world where representation, we've always said a picture is worth 1,000 words, where representation is, I don't want to say compromised, but has been revolutionized and doesn't have the inherent truth value that we once thought it did. So reactions to AI, we talked a little bit about in the two examples that I showed from the art world of sort of high materiality, but I think we can go back to maybe the Dada movement, which appeared in the early part of the last century in reaction to modernism, or maybe kind of a case study of what might happen in our own time. What form that might take, I can't predict, but I think Dada is always with us. Among artists, it's provocative challenge to what we call art. So I think this will continue to happen because art making and art is really going to come under siege more and more as we try to cope with artificial intelligence and its place in the process. So we talked a little bit about noise, and one example was live theater, but there are all sorts of examples, and you can think of more and more the more you think about it. Phonograph record, certainly your favorite. Phonograph record sounds different from the CD. There is a sense of it that is almost ineffable, but it seems to have, to me, when I played the two different, a CD, a digital copy and a phonograph copy, it seems to have a presence about it, maybe call it an aura that the CD doesn't have. And part of that is the noise that gives valuable information about the context of it's a phonograph record from circa 1965. It's been played a lot, so it's kind of scratchy and has a couple of skips in it. but that speaks to the history of the object itself and gives you information. The medium itself, it's a phonograph record made on vinyl or a vinyl substitute, and so forth and so on. So this is all valuable information. And if you expand this concept and this idea, Damon Krukowski uses the example of a woman on a bicycle listening to her earbuds, and she doesn't hear a car, and she has a minor accident with the car because she doesn't hear it. So she doesn't hear the noise, she's concentrating just on the signal. And that's kind of an instructive little example of how important noise can be. And I think it's important. We talked about the theater, how really the sound of the audience, we may look at it, an engineer might look at it as noise, but it is really an important part of the experience and something that you don't want to be without, because it has its own information and own value, experiential value. So photography, we talked a lot about photography, and digital photography, of course, is revolutionized movie making. We've gotten used now to seeing drones, pictures from drones, and as I mentioned, the digital photographic equipment that we have now, much of it is such high quality that we could easily make very impressive motion pictures with the equipment. And it puts filmmaking, video making, if you will, within the reach of almost anybody. And then the editing software enables special effects that once were confined to only certain laboratories. So we talked a little bit about streaming, and I will make sort of an editorial comment at this point that I think the best films are independent films nowadays, and we live in an amazing time because globally there are so many wonderful efforts out there, wonderful films being made by people, oftentimes using Kickstarter, crowdsourcing types of funding, and there aren't the barriers to entry preventing people from talking about, for instance, The Story Won't Die about Syria, or the film on the right, Bitu, about the accidental poisoning of children in India, things that we might not know about, and they're being treated by people who are compassionate and empathetic and very artistic as well. So traditional cinema theaters are becoming less important. That's just a fact. And you think about the historical trajectory, before the advent of television, people would go downtown and catch a movie several nights a week, go to the theater. And we don't really do that now. We might sit down and watch something on Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu, or any one of the number of others. And the specialty streamers, just a huge long list. So the economies of scale favor streaming. The distribution makes it so much easier. So anyway, the film has been revolutionized, and we can sort of see this trajectory from the early so-called silent films to the tremendous conversion to sound on film that Hollywood made circa 1930 at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Now that's, again, seems so long ago, and it was a long time ago. Let's talk briefly about music. This is one of the things I wanted to focus on, and I want to allow some time for comments and questions. So I'm going to kind of try to keep this moving. But the same thing that has happened in these other spheres has happened in music. The home computer revolutionized the production of music. People who were once sort of relegated to the position of being an amateur or an enthusiast can now produce professional quality recordings in their own home. We have a guy here in town, Dan Fisher, who uses MIDI, or musical instrument digital interface language, to produce entire orchestrations played by the London Symphony Orchestra. And that's happening all over the world. Sampling software enables high quality sound, again, digital sound, sampled from great instruments, great players. It enables you to reproduce that on your own computer, on your own audio system. We've all heard Melodyne pitch correction in some of the music we might hear when we're in a grocery store or someplace like that. This is another editing technique, another factor in the equation. So music has been revolutionized and has some ways come full circle from the time in the 19th century when everybody was making music at home. There was no other alternative. You didn't have phonographs, to the professionalization. And now we're back to people making more in their home, I think. But what digital gives, it also takes away, and this is something I briefly want to talk about, and that is the ability of musicians to make a living in the digital age. And what digitalization rather, has done for us in a more philosophical sense of making the entire history of recorded music available so simply. And does that engender the kind of respect that we want to have and should have, I suppose, to sound prescriptive? This is, I don't expect you to read this, so the only reason I put this up here was to kind of give you a sense of the labyrinth of the music business at this point. I had to cut the flow chart in two. The left side is the top, the right side is the bottom. But the writer or composer is up on the left side. The composition, the publisher, that was the sort of the traditional triangle. But in order to make a living in the music world nowadays, you have to negotiate this kind of complexity in terms of getting paid, getting royalties for your composition, for your performance. If you have live performance, then that's a whole nother level of complexity. If your music is on, well, to get your music on Spotify or Sirius XM, Apple Music, is a very arduous process, and you have to use intermediaries. You can't just go to Spotify and send them your recording and say, can you put this on there? And I think the point is that this is extremely complicated, and it's daunting to say the least, but it offers artists a way to make a living, but it is a very complex process. And the value of each time, let's say you are successful in negotiating, getting your composition, a song or two, or maybe an album, a CD, onto Spotify or Apple Music, then how much do you get paid each time that music is accessed by somebody? It turns out that it's just a small fraction of a cent. And this favors people like artists, I should say, like Taylor Swift, whose streams are in the hundreds of millions. She can really earn a pretty good living from that, but it's very difficult if you don't have that kind of, quote, star power. For instance, on Apple Music, you'd have to have 100,000 streams to get $1,000, according to this graphic. And Spotify, I know, uses an additional sort of measure, which is your share of all the streaming, to calculate how much you would be paid. So it's a very difficult proposition. That's kind of the point I want to make. And it offers artists away, but is it any easier or better than the old days when you would go out to Capitol Records in Hollywood and give them a demo tape? I don't know. Interesting anyway. There are alternatives, and I think this again offers musicians hope. There are co-op platforms and ways of reforming, so to speak, the business so that it is more oriented toward the artist, enables the artist to make some kind of a decent living. So I think to kind of start wrapping this up, because I want to allow a little time for questions. We've really, to go back to Walter Benjamin and his observations, there really is an aura to the individual autonomous art object that was originally enshrined in a particular location. And we are far beyond that now, although we could go back to that at any point. And I think that's one thing that may happen in a very much of a niche or small scale way, because I think artificial intelligence and the digital world obviously is not going to go away. It's only going to become more pervasive. But this difference between the copy and the original is an important principle of understanding art objects in our time, in our point in history. So to try to sum things up, and please interrupt me at any time, but I just kind of want to try to make this integrated. Photography radically changed art. Painters, out of necessity, focused on the character of painting itself once photography emerged as a discipline in its own right, however controversial it might have been. And sound recording, once thought to be a way of, simply a way of dictating and making a sort of audio gallery of people's voices, changed the character of music and music listening, and people 150 years ago probably wouldn't have thought of listening to music while you do the dishes, for instance. And yet that became possible with the phonograph. And motion picture photography in particular opened up what Benjamin called the optical unconscious, a whole world that is there for us to see, but that we can't see because we needed the ability to slow things down and really see things up close. Sense of time was radically changed. Time as a dimension in its own right became more subject to exploration in as a result of these new technologies. We saw how the great early filmmakers, and again, I apologize for not being able to do more with film itself, it was just too big a topic, used filmmaking apparatus to create an entirely new set of aesthetic and narrative conventions for film. We had to create a new way of telling stories. How do you keep audiences on track and yet do all the things that you could do to give people an experience? And the mass character of the medium really was visible early on with Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which it would have been great to do a whole course on this film alone. Because I think Roger Ebert's sort of capsule summary of it, that it was a film that argued for evil, but was not evil in itself. It exploded. So anyway, we could see how film as a mass medium dominated the 20th century. And this again was something that Benjamin saw, particularly the political dimension. Pop art and neo-dada, always challenging art, always asking the question of what art is, what makes an art object different from some other object. Is it just because we put it in a museum or write a critical review of it? And then we talked about the postmodern use of pastiche or parody, irony. There's very little art anymore that isn't, painting in particular, that isn't ironic, because that trope in some ways is all that's left for painting, given everything else that has happened. So if there are any questions, I mean, I'd love to have a discussion. I hope I've allowed some time for that. Any comments, anything that you wanted to revisit or discuss? Anything I left out that you wanted to include?
Yeah, Clay, we had a comment here from David Blatt, and I would encourage David, if he is comfortable, to come off mute and share this question with you, because perhaps he can frame it as best he is.
Okay.
As best he wanted. David, go ahead.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is, in this era of disinformation, the scariness of the capabilities that you're describing seems immense. Birth of Nation, I hadn't even thought of that till you brought it up toward the end. But in the current era where, Photoshop has now got its video versions, who knows what reality is? So it was interesting you talked about that. And secondly, for those of us who think that the understated is really a wonderful part of movies and art, the more special effects that can be done sort of undermines all that. Just how great it is to allow your imagination to carry on with the next step of the thing that's actually now being shown. So just interesting in your thoughts of that.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, with both those points. As far as the ability of AI or the editing capabilities that we have, there has to be a sort of a commensurate rise in our capacity to understand media. And this has been going back to Marshall McLuhan in the 60s and his writings. This is something that it almost has to be a mandatory part of our curriculum, that it's imbued in our character, I think, from long ago, that if something's in print, it must be true. And as a former newspaper guy, I always appreciated that. But it also, one, it isn't true. And but the principle, which is behind it, is once something is formalized and like that, it's subject to criticism, not criticism in terms of the negative way we might think, but criticism in terms of, okay, where is this coming from? Basic questions. Who's saying this? Why might they be saying this? Do I know of other things that are like, so on and so forth, the basic skills that if you go back to Platonic dialogues and Socrates, when he would talk to people in the marketplace in Athens to try to get at the truth, we're going to have to be better consumers of information. I know a lot of people have said that, but it's not so much that we're going to be better consumers. We have to really be critical consumers, critical listeners and observers. And as you say, getting to your second point, we have to recognize that spectacles are spectacles, and that understatement, or at least a matter-of-fact statement, and it is a very important part of accurate communication. And we're going to have to be aware of common cognitive errors that we all make. Anchoring, for instance, when we or confirmation bias, tendencies like that humans have, that have sort of evolutionary advantages, but in today's world, we need to really be aware. So those are two really good points. Thanks for bringing those up.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. If anyone else has any comments or questions for Clay, now is the time. You can come off mute and share those. I just wanted to follow up on one thing, Clay, you mentioned specifically about films that were produced on iPhones, which I think is a fascinating subset of films. One of those is available on Netflix if you're interested in watching it. It's called High Flying Bird, and it's directed by Steven Soderbergh, who is actually a prolific film director of modern film. Another is called Tangerine from Sean Baker. And then the third is actually an Oscar-winning film called Searching for Sugar Man. It won Best Documentary Feature a number of years. Those are just three that I can think of right off the top of my head that you mentioned or that you clarified there.
Yeah, Sugar Man, that's a great story.
Yeah, that one's not completely on an iPhone, but basically he ran out of money. So in order to finish the project, his funders required him to actually film it on his phone because they wouldn't give him any more money. Terry, I see you've come off mute. Feel free to comment or question.
I just have a quick question about drones, about how they're controlled. It's very interesting at the real estate business when they go to sell a house, and one recently was for sale on Lake Mac. My gosh, it makes you look like you're living in a private island, and the way they do all their focusing, and you sometimes think, is that really false advertisement? Or about the real estate companies have really sort of exploded with this drone advertising, showcasing your house. And is that someone, I don't know, on land that's controlling it, but I don't know how they enhance those pictures, but they're perfect. And it's not a perfect spot all the time.
Yeah, I think that would come under the heading of what I was talking in response to David's question or comment rather, that we really need to be technologically savvy about the capabilities of wide angle lenses and drone technology, and to realize and try to be I guess maybe this all comes under the heading of living in our time is a tremendous privilege. I mean, look at all the advantages that we have, and I won't enumerate them, but there's also a huge responsibility that we can't have a 17th century mentality in a 21st century world. And it's incumbent upon us to know about these things and be slow to judgment, perhaps, slower than we might have been 200 years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good question. Good point.
Clay, we had another question come into the chat window, and I'm going to invite Patty Brink if she'd like to come off mute and address it directly. Otherwise, Patty, I'm happy to read it on your behalf. Seeing her not come off, I will address it here, Clay. And it's more of a general question, but maybe you can frame it in terms of your subject regarding David's comments on misinformation and how technology advances are allowing us to create misinformation. In a lot of ways, we can attribute quotes and we can attribute even now video that's been doctored to political candidates and others on social media platforms. Do you see any current efforts to subvert that, or anything that the digital community or the technological community is doing to try to circumvent misinformation?
Well, I think in the long haul, I think we'll be able to come up with ways of perhaps trying to bring back some ways of authenticating communications. And I know that quantum computing offers the promise of hack-free communication, but that's still maybe 10 years away. I think ultimately we'll come up with some ways maybe of helping human beings navigate through a sea of questionable information. But meanwhile, I guess we will have to really study our own past and the thoughts of some of the great thinkers and develop our own abilities to understand and try to avoid cognitive bias that leaves us open to these disinformation and misinformation sources. So that's about all I could really say, but I wanted to thank everybody for being a part of this. It's been so fun for me, and I hope it's been beneficial for those of you who were in the course.
Thanks, Clay. We do have a quick second. So David, if you want
Okay.
to say something.
Yeah. No, I'm
David,
here as long as you want.
Well, yes, well, I want to say thank you. You're a genius, and you're
Thanks.
integrating so many philosophical, historical, artistic, technological. I mean, it's really, my brain's going to explode in about 1 second. It'll be your fault. But I guess I'm pessimistic about the, excuse the term, but the general population about doing the kind of reflective concern about the quality of information they're getting. I mean, that's just not what's seeming to happen when you look around right now. And I guess sort of like the dilemmas for the guys developing the nuclear weapons, that there's the science guys who don't pay attention to what the real world implications are. So the better they get at advertising and technological manipulation of everything that we can sense, that we can see, hear, feel, it's scary. It's very exciting, but scary. You studied this so closely. Are the guys who are developing this stuff, are they worried about the misuse?
Well, I can't really say. I'm sure a lot of folks are. In every in everything that I've read or seen about AI, there's always a lot of caveat going on. So I share your concern. I don't want to be pessimistic because I just don't want to go there. But I agree with you that there's not a lot of reason to be optimistic, but I think we need to work on it, and everybody needs to be a part of that. And otherwise, we're going to be living in a real dystopia. And so I would get back on one of my hobby horses, which is the liberal arts at that point. I think people really need a liberal arts education. And by that, I mean studying great works from our past, not just the Western past, but the entire global storehouse of learning. And that's going to be a tall order, I agree, but I don't think we have a good choice, really.
I prefer being optimist by nature. Also.
It's kind of the old saying, Clay, with great power comes great responsibility. And as they develop this new technology, they should be responsible for what effects it has. I just want to I see Mike Renault has come on a video, so I want to come to him briefly, but I just want to make sure, Patty Brink, I see that you're still on. Did I address your question appropriately, or did you want to reframe anything to Clay?
Amy.
Oh, you were wonderful at adding to it. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Patty.
This is.
Oops, sorry, I think I cut you off, Patty. If you want to unmute and say that one more time, I apologize.
Oh boy.
That's my fault. We'll let her come back on. I think she was just reiterating that she appreciated the class today. But I will go down to Mike. Mike, if you want to unmute yourself, if you had a comment or a question.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, Mike. Mike didn't have a question. I apologize. Any last minute comments before we close today? Patty, I'm sorry, I cut you off. I see you're back off mute. Did you want to add anything before we closed?
No, this was a wonderful class. Thank you so much.
Good, glad to hear it.
With that, I will thank you all for joining us for the past 3 weeks. It's been wonderful. Thank you to Clay for all of your preparation. This was a full 3 weeks. So thank you very much for all the work that you've done and for your flexibility to make this class work for us. Again, a reminder to all of you, if you're still on and you have not yet completed your HASP Forward survey, today is the last day to do so. So you can find the link that was just emailed to you this morning as a chance to do that. And please include comments in there for Clay, and include comments in your evaluation of Clay of how much you appreciated this class. And Clay, I think you mentioned on my tally about eight or nine classes additionally that you've now agreed to present. So we're going to be coming back to you for those.
Okay.
I'm sure we'd all love a historical look at the birth of a nation. And
Yeah.
I know not just you, but many other classes have mentioned this. So that'd be a wonderful addition to our curriculum.
Good
So
idea. Good idea.
thank you again. And
Thank you.
if you have any questions or comments for Clay, please include them in your evaluations. If we don't see you again before the holiday, wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and enjoy a happy and healthy holiday with your families. Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much, everybody.